This is Scott Barber, and I'm the senior pastor at Restoration Presbyterian Church in Atlanta, Georgia. We recently hosted the guys from Thinking Out Loud to give 2 talks and a Q&A at our church for a symposium on understanding and answering our cultural moment. Our church really came away with a better understanding of the culture where God has planted us, a common vocabulary that allows us to process our culture with one another, and a new confidence to be salt and light where God has planted us. If you are considering hosting Nathan and Cameron at your own event, I would highly recommend it, as our church is already asking when we can have them back. Here's Nathan giving that second talk.
Well, good morning. Aren't you a interesting crew to get up on a Saturday morning to come out and think about these issues? Also, thanks to you as a congregation for your support of Thinking Out Loud, and many of you as individuals who keep us going and on the move. I was going to title the talk this morning, The Transcultural Vision of the Church, but given Cameron's conclusion last night when he said we're talking about the long game here, I think maybe it's more fitting to think of my talk this morning as the long game in the short run. And so the question is, what is it that we're supposed to be doing in the midst of the context that Cameron has outlined for us? And I hope to take this in an encouraging direction. Cameron ended on the concept of hope, and we want to put some teeth to that idea this morning as we work through this. To give you some background to how I'm approaching this and how I think about it in some context, I know it's, often the way a speaker does. I studied this, I teach here, I do this and that. Here's a different introduction to me that might help you understand the posture that I have toward this idea of cultural engagement and the future of the church. And it goes like this. My name's Nathan, son of Julian, son of David, son of Joseph, son of Joseph, son of Samuel, son of Joseph, son of Matthias, son of Henry, son of Nicholas, son of William, who in 1688 crossed the ocean, came to this country preaching. And then for those next 11 generations have all built and planted churches and taught and with their families, sometimes literally built churches, planted churches, were missionaries. And so for 336 years, my family has been preaching and teaching the exact same gospel and singing some of the same hymns, and there's a phenomenal momentum that the church has. And so we can look at something like the upcoming election. Oh, who's going to be president? And I can look back just through my family history and say, you know what? We built and planted churches 88 years before the United States was even an idea. And then through the next 45 presidents, through depressions and world wars and droughts and plagues and disease, and the church is still here. And you as Presbyterians also have that history that goes even farther back. And so part of what I want us to look at this morning is that though the culture around us is changing drastically, some of that change puts us back into what a more normal Christian church experience has been. And so as things get chaotic around us, actually our experience will parallel what it means to be a Christian more normally in the rest of the world. And then those resources open up to us as a foundation of a reminder of God's faithfulness to the church moving forward through time in what it is that he has for us to do. Now, to work in on this, because we take what Cameron said, and I love the philosophical, cultural analysis. And we, it's always good to have somebody who can go read the German and French philosophers who went crazy, or the Russian ones who are writing about old women and vodka and dead horses and, nihilism and all that. And it's phenomenally helpful, and we have to do that. But in order to understand the role of the church in our time and what it is then we should be up to, instead of going the philosophical version this morning, I'm going to try the more biological and agricultural version of articulating this. You do have a guy back there with a chicken on his shirt, so I think this will work, to help us think of another way of looking at this. Mark Knoll has talked about American synthesis, about what is it that makes American culture unique. James Davidson Hunter uses the word a hybrid enlightenment, to say you have really 2 main features that make America as a culture a unique and special thing in the history of the world. And one of that is Christianity, and the other side of that comes from the Enlightenment. So if you think of the church, the core principles of Christianity, and then recognize the Enlightenment and the values of freedom and equality and justice and property rights and all of that. It's the blend of those two things that make American culture. And I think it's important that we recognize that, because a lot of people say, no, America is Christian culture. Kind of. It's certainly one of the parents of it, but it's very difficult to get property rights, free speech, voting, the Second Amendment, and to force that back into Jesus' mouth. It doesn't, some of the things that we take for granted as Americans and say, this is American culture, no, it doesn't directly come out of the gospel. It's the hybrid of Christian values that support it in alignment, and then it's the marriage of those two things that produces the culture that many of us are proud to be part of and love and respect, and has been so impactful around the world, and such a unique experiment in the history of organizing a society. But there's an element here here's where the little biology lesson comes in for the morning. Let's say that you have a Rhode Island red rooster. This is a breed of chicken that lays brown eggs, and it's a good chicken. Rhode Island red chicken lays brown eggs. Then you have the Leghorn chicken, which lays a lot of white eggs. Rhode Island red, Leghorn. So one lays brown eggs, one lays white eggs. Turns out that if you take a Rhode Island red rooster and made it to a Leghorn hen, that you get a phenomenal chicken that is super hardy, super productive, and lays lots and lots of large brown eggs. So you have two variants of the same species that, when they're combined, the hybrid is more vigorous than either of the parents. And so in biology, they call this heterosis, or hybrid vigor. It means that the offspring of the two distinct things is actually more robust in certain features than either of its parents, and there are genetic and biological reasons that thing is true. It's called an F1 hybrid, familial one. You have two different parents, but the offspring is stellar and vigorous. So if James Davidson Hunter is not using chickens to make this illustration when he's talking about American hybrid. But if you use that analogy and you kind of think of the church as the Rhode Island red rooster and the Enlightenment as the Leghorn hen, it's the unification of those two things. It's the F1 hybrid that is the American culture that we know and love and celebrate, and we largely feel is we're slipping and losing. Now, what's interesting about the way that this works is you cannot take an F1 hybrid and cross it with an F1 hybrid and get anything productive. It's not a new kind of chicken. You don't know what you're going to get. And so you can't just have this happen once and then all of a sudden have a whole new line of great chickens. It has to happen in every single generation. And so if you eat brown eggs, you're eating the result of an F1 familial one hybrid crossing of two different strains of chicken that produce the brown eggs that you're eating in the grocery store. But in order for that to happen, that means that somewhere, somebody is maintaining a flock of pure Rhode Island Reds, and somebody is maintaining a flock of pure Leghorns, because you have to have that as the breeding material in order for the hybrid to happen to perpetuate. And so it isn't enough for American culture to, at one point, we have this good Protestant Christianity, and it married to the Enlightenment values, and then boom, it creates its own thing and it just runs forever. It doesn't work like that. Each generation has to reunite in order to get the hybrid vigor of what is American culture. And so part of what we see happening when we're doing our cultural analysis is we're looking at that, but I'm asking us to separate back out and say, okay, what are the parental lineages of American values and American culture? And we can look down the direction of the future of Enlightenment thinking, the application of that, what's happening in the academy, which Cameron very much laid out for us last night, big ideas, and I think the church largely was a front runner in a lot of that movement and how that all shapes out. That's where our cultural analysis happens on the concepts of freedom and equality, and we can look at difficulties happening in the modern higher educational system and see the kind of the crumbling of that. But I want us to set that aside just for a moment and say, you know what, some of you in here may be called to that. There will be Christians who are engaged in maintaining and supporting and developing the core values of the Enlightenment, and that's good. And that's maybe the church, maybe you personally are called into that. But there's the other strain here that you are definitely called to maintaining, which is the church. And so the argument that I'm making this morning is that unless you have a stable, solid, actively engaged church, you will never be able to continue to perpetuate the concept of American culture without that existing as, to use the crude phrase here, kind of breeding stock for the synthesis that makes America what it is. So the idea of, we hold these truths to be self-evident. That comes from the Christian side. Private property, that comes from the Enlightenment side. And you have to have both of those in order to get what it is that we experience as Americans today. But for the direction that I want us to go here, I want us to think down through this list of what is it that we can focus on here in 2024 as the church that continues to perpetuate this long game that God has been up to through the church in America, and how do we not get distracted at times by, what culture says this person says this person says this book says this theologian, this politician, and you just kind of feel like a squirrel in the road, right? Back and forth, and then you get hit by the car. So how do you not get into that trap as a church is what I want us to just narrow our lens on here and focus this morning. And so on one hand, it might sound like I'm calling for a sense of, don't worry about culture or cultural withdrawal. For our focus, that's true, but actually for the long-term impact, in order for the American synthesis or the hybrid enlightenment to perpetuate, we have to do this as a ministry to the future of the country. So it seems kind of counterintuitive, but does that train of thought think that we have to maintain the core distinction of what it is that we are as a church, not just for the future of what God is doing in the church, but also for the future of what God is doing in the country and the church's role in responding to that. So we can't lose our distinctiveness in this generation and expect the church to have an influence in the future. We have to do both at the same time. And so as Cameron's thinking about and helping us lean into, I'm glad he went this direction because I don't have to, is when he's looking at nihilism and the idea of meaninglessness and purposelessness and making our own meaning or deciding that nothing matters, really the antidote that the church brings to that is this term you may have heard called worship. Worship is what happens when we're worshiping? Fundamentally, our worship is a response to beauty, truth, and goodness. If I could say it in a Scottish accent, you'd be like, that's Stuart speaking there. When we look at something, we're like, whoa, that's awesome. That's worship. We're seeing truth, we're seeing goodness, we're seeing beauty. If you look at old hymns, they're kind of like there's a line or two of theology that you sing, and then there's the chorus that comes in of hallelujah, praise the Lord. That is a response. It's this erupts out of us in response to the goodness of what we see happening. So rather than this inward focus of saying, well, nothing matters, there's no external referent, it all comes from within me, it's this inward curl that we're fighting against when we worship, to have an outward focus on what is it that God is doing in the world, what is the beauty that's being created, what is the truth that's being communicated, how do we live righteously, what is the good. That's what we come to church to do when we worship. And so our worship is actually a rebellion against nihilism, because we're saying there are true things, there are meaningful things, there is real beauty. There are things that we actually can have communion with, that multiples of us as individuals can come together around truths and form community. And so our worship is the prerequisite then, not just for the proper understanding of who God is, but also for the relationships that we have with each other. Because suddenly we have a shared experience of the goodness and the splendor of God. And so it's the direct opposite of saying there's no broader purpose and that all comes from me and I have, and we kind of pick on Americans as pragmatists, but there's a part of this that it works. When you look at the world around you of saying, here's a group of people who have really now embraced this philosophy to the full, and they're all miserably medicated trying to have a coping mechanism to survive. Or you have the people who are full of the joy of the Lord is my strength. How does that happen? And it comes from actually not focusing on ourselves that we find the most fulfillment in life. And so what Jesus comes and does in his teaching and preaching and reminding us of the character and nature of God is always counterintuitive. You wouldn't have made this up in advance, that you find your life by losing your life, and you find meaning in life by serving others. And it's this counterintuitive outward focus that provides the meaning and satisfaction and fulfillment that we have in our lives. And so, some of people apparently are so good at this that they only have to come to church twice a year in order to be able to do this. Those people are amazing to me. what vigor, what stamina they have spiritually that they can do that. I wrote him a little note one time, I need to have a revival service at least once a day in my life. Or I'm not going to make it. I have to be continuously recalibrated that the orientation of my focus is external. The theologian James Davidson Hunter wrote, and I think this is he said that for Paul, salvation was primarily a shift in focus. What are you going to look at? Therefore, set your mind on things above where Christ is seated. It's I can look at this is miserable, the economy, and Israel's bombing Iran now, and that could trigger this, and North Korea is doing this with Russia, or therefore, set your mind on things above. It's not to say that we ignore this, but we don't find the value of our lives or what it means to be human and looking at the external circumstances around us. It's how do we focus well on what it is that God is doing? How do we remember who's running the world? And then think about what is my responsibility as a result of that. What ends up happening, though, that as we drop out of the concept of kind of a nihilism or looking to culture for how it is that we ought to be living, and we start focusing on Christ, that some distinctives start to develop in what it means to be a Christian in our time. And tensions happen culturally. Recently, I was in conversation with somebody who was really out of sorts about the whole story of Elisha and the bears. You remember he's going up and the youth come out and they're taunting him and the bears come out of the woods and, how could this happen? What's going on here? And there's a fascinating thing that when you look at the Old Testament and you look at Scripture, that worship and honor are considered more valuable than life. And one of the ways that you see this worked out is that in the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not murder is number 6. Now, I guarantee you that if we as Americans were making a list of rules, or the American 10 Commandments, or purely an Enlightenment value set of how would you structure a society, what would be number 1 on our list of do's and don'ts? Don't kill each other. Don't murder. Well, how is it that you have don't murder doesn't show up until number 6? Well, it happens because how do the 10 Commandments start? Proper worship. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. Don't have any other idols. And down on through, including honor your mother and father, happen before you get to don't murder. And it turns out there's a really good reason for that, multiple, but one of those is thou shalt not murder does not make sense as a first principle. If you're just starting there, if you don't have a vision of oughtness of what it is that is important for God for meaningful human relationships. But as we live in a culture where it's, all right, don't kill each other. I was just texting with a friend who's a pastor in another city. He said, hey, we're on track to have our highest homicide rate ever this year. It doesn't work culturally to tell people just not to kill each other, apparently. You have to have this higher vision. And so what we're doing as a church is we're reminding ourselves of the fact, hey, I'm all for don't murder, okay? Just in case there's any, don't. But the reason for that is because we have this orientation toward what it is that God wants. And we start there, and unless we have this concept of but you can see how this creates a tension because we as a church are just focused on something different than the culture, but we have to have that focus in order for culture to have that principle. And so we do not create culture. Culture is actually downstream from the work of the church and what God is doing. It's not like we can run around and find, what's Harvard Business School think? And we're going to take those strategies and then we're going to build a church based off of. Why would we look to the people who are confused about how to structure the family of God? And so it's simple when we say that. It makes it obvious when we lay it out like that. But there's this subconscious tendency for us as Christians to have this, we're missing out on the next business principle or next model for, no, you're not. And let me be so bold as to say is that you can actually not know anything about cultural engagement, have read none of the books that Cameron has, and lead a meaningful Christian life of, you guys talk about faithful presence in this congregation, I'm sure, that honors the Lord and is a deep part of shaping the culture of the world around you as a byproduct of your worship of God. So many of the things that we get distracted by, we try to circumvent by going directly to the offspring without remembering where does this actually come from. And so our job as a church in our worship is not just for the proper realignment of our own hearts toward God, but it does have a culturally stabilizing factor in the way in which it gets meaningfully worked out in a community, in a neighborhood, and especially in our own homes. So it's a different set of priorities that have benefits that contribute to American culture, but they don't come from American culture, which leads me to say that in order to change that culture, you don't really have to focus on it sometimes. Does everybody follow that little zigzag around there of saying the faithful, steady, long obedience, long game that Cameron was talking about is what gives stability to the church. And Stuart used the word plausibility structure in the introduction. I think that's what I started recognizing. So I spent 3 years speaking in a lot of the student groups, a lot of Ivy League schools in New England, running around back and forth, and I could argue and debate and speak about hope and metaphysics and all of this, and it sounds great, and it holds up intellectually in a robust way against all the modern philosophy. In fact, there aren't that many great modern philosophies, so it's kind of easy to win some of those arm wrestling matches. But unless there was a group of people who was actually living out what I was talking about, it didn't matter. You can have a great idea, but if nobody can do it, what's the point? And so that the idea of the church being the plausibility structure, to use Stuart, he's borrowing that from some other folks' language, is that there has to be a group of people who is actually worshiping and focused on something different and living life together in a way that somebody could say, these are very interesting ideas you had. When Paul was in Acts 17, he had to be able to say, and this is what it looks like when you actually live this out. And so the church has to, and we'll talk about then that the church is God's enterprise, but the church cannot lose its focus and its worship by getting distracted about what's happening in culture. Interested, sure. Concerning, sure. But focus-wise, a little bit irrelevant in the broader scope of what God is doing. I hate to say that because when I say it's a little bit irrelevant, it tastes funny coming out of my mouth because we're so conditioned for this to be so important for us to engage the culture so well and to know the terminology and the distinctions. Yeah, I guess. But historically, it hasn't been the case. And globally, looking at the church, that hasn't necessarily been the case. What happens then? Okay, so we say that our worship is the antidote to nihilism. What is the byproduct and what is the outcome of this? And it leads to a distinctiveness collectively as a church and a people of God. And Stuart and I were talking about this last night, but I think the image that works best in my mind, particularly, I think maybe in the southeastern part of the United States, is that, so if I go like this, I have, one finger behind the other, but if I hold them overlapping like this, and I'm looking at Judah there, how many fingers am I holding up? It looks like one, right? And so I think we've lived in a time in which our concept of God and country was like this. It looked like the same thing. And now we're living in a time where people are starting to see this happen. And the thing that we thought was one thing were two things stacked on top of each other that are starting to separate out. This was the American synthesis. This was the American hybrid. And now all of a sudden we say, hey, what's happening in the academy or what's happening in politics is no longer aligning with the values that we had as the people of God, as the church. And there's this our eyeballs can't adjust quickly enough to this movement that's happening. Now, this is not to say that this is bad. It's just to say that as this shift happens, we can't, as a church, say, well, American culture is over, and we're losing the academy, and we're losing the political front, and therefore there's no hope for the church. That's not true theologically, and it's not true practically. But if we maintain our focus on the church is the bride of Christ, it is the people of God. This is, I've read to the end, the church wins. Spoiler alert. This is my focus over here in the church. And so I can lament that this is happening. I can appreciate the culture, and this is the time that, some of you were born in or grew up in, but that ship is sailing. And so we have to be able to, as it separates, you can't have your feet in both of those things that are going opposite directions at the same time. This is a time for the church, I think, to say we're going to put both of our feet on the side of the church here, and we're going to do that even if that puts us in fundamental tension with the world around us. We have had a really weird experience in the United States. It's been 410 years in my family since anybody's been executed for preaching. And I'm really happy about that. I've been trying to keep that record going. But none of those were in America, right? But the common Christian experience throughout history has that you follow Christ, you're rejecting the idols of the world, you're choosing to focus here, and you are going to be weird and difficult and different in the eyes of the world, and you're going to suffer for it. This is you don't have to go back in 64 AD when Nero, voice of the martyrs. I mean, this is a modern, and so what I think is shocking for us as Americans is to say that there's a fundamental tension developing between my worship of an almighty God and the direction of the culture around me, and it's going to start hurting to be faithful. Oh no. But what we're trending toward is a more classically normal Christian experience. And so once we trend back into that direction, the resources of our past and of our history of how do you be faithful in the face of difficulty, 1 Peter is the whole thing. It's about being holy in the context of suffering. The New Testament starts making sense to us when we recognize that the culture in which we live and what it means to be a Christian are not synonymous in the same way. I'm not looking forward to this. I'm not saying, let's go out there and stick our head in the grinder. But when it gets difficult, the church has deep resources on how it is for us to maintain a faithful walk with God in the context of difficulty and suffering. It's there. So, again, just to summarize, I'm not saying it's good, but I'm also saying it's definitely not a game changer. It's definitely not a showstopper. The church is not going to die because of whatever happens in November, however it goes, or the next November or the next November. And so we have to kind of decide which, to continue the metaphor, which basket are you going to put your eggs in here? Which baskets and how many of which eggs. And so this distinction and difference is going to come out and find a difficulty, and historically that has led to church growth because people then start suffering somehow with joy, and it becomes contagious in that way. And so there's this normal sense of there's the culture around us, and then there's a church culture that forms here. And to use Os Guinness's phrase, he says, culture is a way of doing life together. That's a good, simple description. But in order for us to have a concept of church culture, that means that it has to be a way of life together. A way of life. And we have these fragments. My grandpa likes to say, you can go into a Home Depot and it has all the parts to build a house, but it has none of the elements of what it takes to build a home. You have all the pieces, but you don't have them fit together in a way that provides meaning. And so we live with these vestiges of lots of Christian pieces. We have Christian preschool, we have Christian school, we have Christian universities, we have Christian investing, we have Christian financial policies, we have Christian radio, we have Christian home decor, we have Christian chicken sandwiches, we have, all hail Chick-fil-A, I get it. But I'm saying we have all these pieces of Christianity, but we're slowly saying, wait, but is there we have the pieces of a house, but do we have a home? Is there a real way of life here? That this permeates the fabric of the way that I live and move and have my being. The way that I treat my wife and my children and the way that my home is organized, is it fundamentally oriented around a worship of God and what flows from that? Or am I saying, I kind of have these pieces in the right bumper sticker and Christianity is a nice thing that I stick to the back of the pursuits of my life? And that form of Christianity is not going to have the resources to maintain itself into the future of whatever difficulty or joy the Lord has for us as American Christians. It doesn't work as an accessory. It doesn't work as an add-on. It can only be the leading and the guiding thing, and in its robust form, that's where we find it. So we're not learning from culture. It's downhill from us. It's the idea that this distinctiveness that is going to develop around what it means to be Presbyterian, perhaps, to be in this part of Georgia, to be an American Christian, will, at times, require us to be different, and we're going to have to look at that and say, yeah, that's about right. Mark 13:13, Jesus said, they hated me, they'll hate you too. I have not heard a good sermon on that recently. And so, I was listening to one preacher one time, and he said, he's like, I hear people out there, he's like, well, people at work are mean to me, or they look down on my faith or whatever. He's like, well, maybe it's not because of your faith. Maybe you're just an annoying person. It's not synonymous that you can't blame Christ for all the problems that you have. But there is a sense in which we have to start saying no to things because of what we're saying yes to. It's not reactionary against something. It's to say, you know what, we're for this. And that gets awkward. My daughter's 11, public school, all my kids are, and they're going on this week camping thing. And one of the things was this breathing exercise, yoga, self-awareness, meditation thing on connecting with spirituality and all this. And I kind of wrote back and forth with an organizer and said, hey, you know what? These practices are held very deeply by a religious group. We're kind of using their religious practices as a form of entertainment. And as Christians, we're all about spirituality and meditation and engagement with nature. That has no problem for us. But it seems like this isn't being talked about as with the religious connotation that it is. And so out of kind of our family's respect for other religions and out of our own respect for the things that we're trying to grow toward, can my daughter do something different? So she sat on a picnic table and rode read Aldo Leopold while they were out there in the cat position, and she came home and she said, well, for my dignity and my faith, I was glad I wasn't part of that. But that's a tough thing to ask your kid to do something different than everybody else in their class, isn't it? And you've had experiences like that where you've had to say, you know what, I know everybody's going along with this and this seems like a very simple thing, but actually because of what our primary loves, we're going to say no to this. I love to garden. If you're growing cucumbers and there was a tomato that was on the ground from last year and it starts to grow little tomatoes under your cucumber, the tomato is a good plant, but it's a weed if it's in your cucumber patch. And so it's what are we trying to do here? And once we know what we're trying to do, then we can say, yeah, I want this thing to grow, and no, I want to prune this thing off. And so that distinctiveness is not we're against this, and we're against this, and we don't like that, and we hate these, and it's a casting a vision of this is what we're for. We're just pursuing something different than you are right now. And so the tension and the opposition comes not from we're against everything and we're defined by what we're not. It's we're casting a vision, other activities at school. And kids say, you know what? We're a family that pursues the things of the light, not the things of the dark. And so we want to be about this and not participate in this. And that's going to happen more and more, and we're talking about kids here, but all of us has those decisions to make in the circles and realms and friendships in which we have. So worship gives us the antidote to nihilism. There's a distinction that's going to develop, and that distinction is going to be increasingly less individual and more collective. We're going to say we as a church don't do this. We as a church love and celebrate this. And the communal nature of that distinctiveness will be one of the things that grows, I think, in times of tension. That's actually what has really bound the church together, is the fact that they have each other and no one else in the sense of difficulties in culture. And then finally, how this distinction manifests itself is not an isolationism. It's not we're just going to go build a giant bunker and stick all the Presbyterians in it and wait till it's over. You ever wonder about what an alligator does during a hurricane? Somebody was writing about what did alligators do during Milton. Alligator, pretty thick skin, can hold its breath for 6 hours. Hurricane isn't really a problem. You just go underwater and hold your breath. Then the hurricane's past. And there's something attractive to that about let's just do that as Christians. We're going to hunker down and let the waves go over. Jesus has a multiplication and an invitation nature to the distinctiveness that he preaches. It's always bearing fruit. It's always about the seed that produces the 30, the 60, the 100-fold. It's about being fruitful and multiplying from the beginning. The Great Commission ends, go into all the world. And so it's a very not leaning back on the back foot, think about a boxer. It's very on your toes, leaning forward kind of message. And so the distinctiveness does not lead to isolation. It means a leaning into with this multiplicative, invitational nature of saying this is the good that we are choosing to pursue as the worshipers of God and collectively as a church, and you're invited. It's a door wide open. And so in my mind, the way that I picture this is you can kind of imagine drawing a line here on the ground, and I'm standing behind the line, and we can say, here we are as a church, and here's the culture out there, and there's a difference between a standing embrace and a chasing embrace. The chasing embrace is to say, well, here we are as a church, and here's the culture, and you know what, if we just lower our standards, get rid of some of the prickly, things of what Jesus said, we're just going to run out there and hug everybody and love everybody. We're going to cross the line into culture, lower our standards, kind of nullify some of the things that maybe Paul didn't quite understand what he was saying about that. It's really a barrier to the gospel. We're going to go and grab them. Do you remember when Jesus was teaching and they said, this is a hard teaching? And some of them started to leave, and then Jesus said, oh, wait, I changed my mind, come back. No. His disciples like, this is hard, and he says, what? Do you want to leave too? Jesus does the standing embrace. He draws a line in the sand and says, here's what God has revealed about what's important for your relationship with your Heavenly Father and with each other. And Jesus stands on that line with his arms wide open and says, whosoever come. That's a standing embrace. It's not a chasing embrace. He doesn't lower any standards. He has a distinct category of this is what we believe, and you're invited. And that's part of that capacity that we have as a church to do that. Of this is very clearly what we believe because we believe that this is good, this is true, this is beautiful. We're pursuing that, and you're welcome to come along in that. I think right now, I'm not declaring it like American revival or Great Awakening, but there is a new spiritual hunger and curiosity that's happening. The majority of the churches that I'm going to speak at are growing. I'm flying this afternoon up to speak 3 times at a church, and they're like, we're worshiping about 350 in a sanctuary that holds 300. We're going to build a sanctuary for 700. This is the more normal conversation that's happening these days because I think all of the false gods, science, finance, government, all the things that we thought were going to save us, 4 years ago have largely been shown not to be very fast racehorses in the game of life. And so all of the competitors of the church have slightly been kneecapped in the last, 5 years. And where else should we go? You alone have the words of life is starting to be something that not just Christians recognize, but a lot of other, especially young families my age are saying, how do we want to raise our kids? Does this really work to say, choose your own destiny, be the master of your own destiny? Does it really work to say we have no common cultural values? And so this is a phenomenal time, I think, for the church to be invitational to the curious while maintaining a fixed idea of what we think is true and beautiful and good and what is righteousness, not lowering those standards. And so it's a missional invitation that only comes from our distinctiveness. You have to be different enough from the world that they notice in order for them to desire the things that you have. And so leaning into, I think, such a time in which it was so easy to be a Christian and kind of camouflage into American culture, it just fit seamlessly as we start to distinguish ourselves a little bit and say, no, we don't pursue this. That actually is a prerequisite for our missional growth of people saying, they're doing something a little different there. I wonder what it is in a good way. Somebody had asked, well, first, let me just say this, that there's another thing that's going to shift in this as we think about the future of the church, and that has to do with the good old dollar sign. Where are the resources going to come from? Where does the money come from? And if you think of wealth in terms of skills and knowledge and relationships, not just the dollar, then there's a phenomenal amount of wealth in the church. I think even if you looked in this congregation and you said, what are the skills that are here? What are the relationships that are here? What's the knowledge that is here? And how do we maximize that wealth for the future stability of our children and for our church? And we're going to need some money to do it. But the money doesn't drive the vision. The vision drives the support of it. And so think about that as a congregation. What is it that we're good at? If you wanted to think about what does Restoration Presbyterian look like 100 years from now? Or just play it out, when all of you are dead. What do you want to leave behind for those who are going to be worshiping and ministering when you look out the windows in this neighborhood? And, maybe the Lord will come back tomorrow or whatever. But let's plan on God calling us to think strategically about the future. You think about your retirement plan, I bet. Do you think about 50 years from now for the church? How do we posture ourselves in that? Now, what happens in this time? Somebody had asked last night about, is there a cycle to this? You see the positive world, the neutral world, the negative world. And I think Stuart said, look around. This doesn't look like a cycle. It looks like that's true for culture. It's not true for the invitation of the church. And here's how I think this actually will work out. Again, my name's Nathan. I'm not a prophet, just named like one. But here's a funny story that sticks in my mind as a vision of this. So when my youngest brother was a senior in college, he was walking across campus. This was the day in which people printed off papers and handed them in. Some of you is weird, like paper. It was the thing made out of trees. And so he was going to hand in this paper, and as he was walking down the street, there was a car that was broken down, and it had a flat tire, and there were 4 young ladies working on this tire and on this project, and he stopped and he said, hey, would you like some help changing your tire? And they said, no, we got it. And he said, the only reason I mention it is because your flat tire is on the front and you have the jack under the back bumper. And the young lady at the jack got up and said, my uncle is a mechanic. Don't you dare tell me how to change a tire. And he said, okay, and went on his way. Well, about 15 minutes later, when he was on his way back, they had succeeded in jacking the back of the car off the ground. And once you know, the front tire was still on the ground. And he said, hey, would you like to have some help changing your tire? And the other 3 girls said, oh, yes, please, would you help us? And he helped them change the tire. And I think that same thing is probably going to start playing out more in the church's relationship to the world. We're going to say, we have a vision of goodness and truth and beauty. Here's the way to change a tire in the analogy. Would you like us to help you? And the world's going to say, don't you dare tell me how to do it. I'll make my own meaning. I'll come up, And the question is not whether or not that already happens. The question is, will the church exist to come back around the second time and say, would you like me to help you with this? And there are some things in life that this is true in your own life. You just got to run a bad idea to its logical conclusion before you realize it's a bad idea. And I think that is the point where the church then has something meaningful to say to the culture around it. And you don't say that, I told you so, ha, ha, ha. You say, can I serve you? And so that's when I talk about my fascination with the perpetuation and the continuation of the church. and our families and what we're doing, it's this structure of stability. And I don't know, like my kids could all get eaten by a bear or become Buddhist. There's no guarantee in any of this. But I want to raise my children in a way that they are creative and that they have the capacity to exist in a lot of different contexts, and that as certain things shift and change, they can say, that's okay, my eggs aren't actually in that basket. I can navigate through this. And as a congregation, we want to do that strategically, culturally too, and say, hey, that's not a good direction. But fundamentally, when I come to church to worship on a Sunday morning and my Wednesday evenings and my small group and my time of personal study, I have a stability to say, this is sad. It doesn't scare me. It gives me sorrow. That's the direction that I think we want to go. And we won't take time here to read, but I would point to you to Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Galatians 4 and 5, life in the Spirit. What does it mean? Paul's writing to an urban area that is definitely not have a Christian government. This definitely does not have a Christian culture. And he says, what does it mean to live life by the Spirit? You look at Ephesians 5 and following, 16 following, be imitators of God. Here's what you're supposed to be like. Here is a clear-cut, step-by-step, on this day, be imitators of God. So, Galatians, life by the Spirit. Ephesians, be imitators of God. Philippians, have the mindset of Christ. Be imitators of Christ. This is how you're to engage on the day-to-day. I get so wrapped up in the future that I sometimes miss the obvious opportunities in front of me. I think, if we got these people mobilized and them to study together and this person finance this and we got the resources to this and we could plant this thing over here and send this paper and and this seminary could be built and we could mobilize this mission thing. And my wife says, Nathan, go to bed. You're not in charge of the future of the church in North America. I was like, yeah, but it's fun to think about. And so I can get so far out in the hypothetical futures of what might happen and should happen that I miss probably what God has for me to do that day. So dream big, have those visions, have those plans, read the philosophers and the theologians and keep tabs on the culture, but do that after you have reminded yourself each day who is in charge of the world, and remember what your responsibilities are as a result of this, because all of this is God's enterprise. The future of the church does not depend on me. The future of the church does not depend on you. It's the bride of Christ. God's got this. So we take a deep breath. He's got the whole world in his hands. There's some good children's songs here. Are we going to hide it under a bushel? No. We're going to let it shine. And so some of these things that we teach our children as we think is a fun kid song, actually there's a profound theology in that for our cultural engagement and the way in which we need to be living as adults. It's God's church. It is good. We are orienting ourselves toward the exploration, the delight, the experience, and the participation of that. Through the distinction that comes through that, we will remain faithful, and we're going to remain faithful in distinction in a way that is missional and invitational, all under the umbrella of what it is that God is calling us to do. And in doing so, we suddenly have a lifestyle that people might ask us for the reason for the hope that we have. And there's a kind of a gritty joy that comes out of doing it when we're working in alignment with what it is that we were created to do. And in doing so, I think we build a stable church for the glory of God and for our neighbor's good, and that spins off into a core part of what is necessary for the future of whatever the American culture becomes. Let's be faithful to the task that we've been given and allow God to quarterback the play. We'll just run our route. And at the end of the day, he gets the credit for the goodness that happens.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.